Nice. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you so much to the Parking Reform Network for having me. I'm excited to get to chat with you all today. So, I'm Cate. I am a city planner, I'm an educator, I am an urbanist, and I'm also the author of the recently released book, Climate Action for Busy People. It's basically a how to guide for the average person around keeping your community safe from the climate crisis. And there's a lot of overlap between what we can do to keep our communities safe and thinking about the amount of space that we prioritize for cars that are not even in use. If you're anything like me, your phone was blowing up this summer with heat advisory notifications as heat waves rolled across the North American continent. This decade is the hottest that we've had on record, and unfortunately, it's likely to be one of the coolest decades that we've had for the foreseeable future. And often the way that we talk about the climate crisis historically has been couched in this wilderness framework. Everything from tragic stories about polar bears dying as they try to swim 10 miles in between ice floes to crabbers going out of business because the snow crab populations have plummeted due to rising ocean temperatures, and really sad stories about Arctic ice receding as it hits 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time on record. But if you're like me and you live in an urban area, the way that you experience the climate crisis is probably a little bit different than polar bears and snow crabs and really hot ice temperatures. It probably looks a little bit more like this: nuisance flooding, where storm water gets into your basement and destroys your HVAC system, or those clothes that you stored in the basement for next winter. We've also experienced a bunch of super weird heat events that I never grew up hearing about as a kid. Things like heat domes. That picture on the upper left-hand side of the screen is of Portland, Oregon's light rail system, the MAX. A couple of years ago, a heat dome that was so hot settled over the city that it literally melted public transportation infrastructure. And the picture on the left-hand side was one that I had never really seen before until 3 years ago when the East Coast got blanketed in this apocalyptic pink and orange and yellow wildfire smoke that blew all the way across the country from the West Coast. And if I mentioned all of that and you're kind of getting what I call the case of the climate bubble guts, which is this churning anxiety about the climate crisis and what we can do about it, you're probably paying the right amount of attention. This is really alarming stuff. And the solutions that we've been given, especially since the start of the last century, have felt pretty overwhelming. Cut the soda ring cans before you put them in the trash, and reduce your carbon footprint by line drying your laundry, which, as a footnote, you should try to do these things. But it feels a little bit divorced from the enormity of what we're facing as a species and as a culture. And that's part of why I wrote Climate Action for Busy People. The book is roughly divided into three parts. The first is, why do things look the way that they do in our communities? Because our neighborhoods don't look the way they do by accident, which means they're not going to change by accident. There's a history to why some places are struggling with heat, flooding, and poor air quality. And understanding those origins helps us to make better decisions about the future. The second part digs into what you can do now, today, literally right after this webinar to help keep your community safer from the climate crisis if you've only got a couple minutes to a couple hours. And then the final part is around organizing in your local community for a more equitable distribution of climate adaptation resources. And I'm going to touch on all three of these and how they overlap with parking and the use of a lot of our space for cars. If you've seen me speak before, you've probably seen this image. I love to start my presentations off with it because it's just really stark. This is a picture of the Lower Price Hill neighborhood in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, and you're sort of looking northwesternly. And you can pop this in the chat. If I were to ask you which side of the image you would like to be hanging out in on a hot summer day, where would you like to be? If you're anything like me, you probably want to be on the left-hand side of this dotted line on a hot day. There is a tree canopy cover that is casting shade. There is some grass that's going to soak up rainwater. Whereas on the other side of the dotted line, which I can't emphasize enough is literally on the same block, the picture looks starkly different. There aren't a lot of trees, and the ones that do exist are kind of dead or desiccated. They're not doing much to shade the neighborhood. And look at the amount of impermeable pavement. And when I say impermeable pavement, I'm talking about parking lots, driveways, roadways, rooftops, things that have dark impermeable surfaces that are going to absorb the sun's solar radiation and then release it back out through the day and night, contributing to what we call the urban heat island effect. Additionally, without any grass or the roots of mature trees or even dirt to soak up that rainwater, the right-hand side of this picture is a lot more likely to flood than the left-hand side. Now, if you were to hop into a spaceship and fly into the Earth's atmosphere, you would run into the Landsat 7 or Landsat 8 satellites. They're these satellites that NASA puts into space to take a lot of pictures of what's happening on the ground across the globe. And you can look at things like tree canopy cover. This is tree canopy cover, and the picture we were just looking at of Cincinnati, that location is marked with a star on the map. And what we saw in the map with the left-hand side being a lot greener seems to be true across the city, with that left westernly side having a lot more tree canopy cover than the right-hand side. And that has a really big impact on how we experience heat. This slide is of ambient air temperature, so it takes things like humidity and heat into account. And you can see that on that left-hand side where there's a greater tree canopy cover, it's a lot cooler than the right-hand side, which has a lot more pavement. And that has really big consequences for the way that we experience health, well-being, and access to green spaces. If you're to go south from Cincinnati to New Orleans, where I get the pleasure of working with our local organization, Groundwork New Orleans, you may have heard of this really cool park that used to exist called the Claiborne Avenue Park. It ran through an upper class Black neighborhood. It had these beautiful 100-year live oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, and it provided a lot of shade for people who would go to the park to promenade, to see, and to be seen. It also provided a lot of absorption capacity for rain. And if you've ever been to New Orleans, you can be standing outside and a 20-minute rainstorm can drop 6 inches of water, which leads to pretty severe flooding. So this is an important asset to that upper class Black neighborhood. The homes and the businesses all benefited from this park. But like a lot of places in our country, the calling card of urban renewal came through in the 1950s and 60s with the creation of the National Interstate Highway System. And in order to have the highway connected to your state, which is important for commerce and travel and modernization, you had to work with federal planners to site where these highways were going to be. And because there was a group there that lacked a lot of political power, the Claiborne Avenue Park that ran through that upper class Black neighborhood was razed to the ground, as were a lot of the homes and businesses. And in its place was put the Claiborne Avenue Expressway. Without those trees to cast shade and with all of that extra impermeable pavement from the highway and the junction and the roads and the parking lots and the driveways, all of this contributes to New Orleans' position as the #1 heat island in the United States. Additionally, without that green space, that the roots of those mature trees and the grass to absorb the stormwater that comes through New Orleans, especially in the late summer, early fall, you end up with flooding and flash flooding that can come really quickly, destroying people's homes, making it impossible for folks to get to work and making it pretty dangerous in that region. Additionally, if you look at things like air quality, you're probably not going to be surprised, but you might be disappointed. The closer you are, especially to those junction points of the highway, the more pollution that's coming off of the Claiborne Avenue Expressway, and the more likely residents in those neighborhoods are to have asthma as adults. At this point, you might be thinking of clicking off the webinar. Please don't go. I know you're probably surprised. I'm kind of billed as someone who is hopeful, and genuinely I am a hopeful person. And this is where the webinar is going to turn a corner, because in reality, we know how to fix these problems. We already know what to do. If you've ever walked down a tree-lined street that's shaded, if you've ever gotten to enjoy the breeze coming off of a well-maintained, clean, accessible urban body of water, then you've experienced some of these infrastructure solutions that we can use to change our built environment and keep ourselves safer from the climate crisis. Because really, we're only looking to do about 4 things to keep ourselves safe. The first is, in regards to heat, we're looking to either block the sun so it doesn't heat things up, or bounce that sunlight away so that it doesn't contribute to that urban heat island effect, heating up the ground and then radiating that heat back out into the air. And from a flood perspective, we're looking to make sure that that water can get from the sky to the ground to the sewer system without obstruction, or that there's enough green space around to absorb and hold onto that water so that it doesn't end up in people's basements or flooding roadways. And as you probably have guessed by now, parking lots, impermeable pavement, that's a huge culprit. in adding to the urban heat island effect and in adding to nuisance flooding in our communities. I don't know exactly how much space, and maybe one of the PRN folks has a sense. I don't actually know how many parking lots there are and how much area is dedicated to it. But I do know, at least for roadways, we've got about 2.5 million miles of asphalt. And those are just in well-maintained major roads. And the average parking spot that we see in sort of a strip mall or a parking lot setting is about 100 square feet, sometimes a little bit less. And that's not counting the amount of space that you need to turn around to make a 3-point turn, to circle looking for a spot. So we're dedicating a lot of space to this asphalt that has negative effects on how we experience the climate crisis. And one of the upsides to reducing parking is that we're also reducing the use of cars, and that has some pretty demonstrable benefits for people. First is cooler and cleaner air. We talk a lot, I think, in our culture when we talk about cars, about greenhouse gases and the emissions that are coming from the burning of fossil fuels, but also things like pulverized rubber are pretty bad for us. That pulverized rubber gets kicked up into the air and is very hard for human lungs to clear. So if people are driving less, that's less greenhouse gas emissions, less heat that's coming from the combustion engine to add to our already hot summers, and a lot less pulverized rubber that ends up in the lungs of ourselves and our families. I also am a big believer that land is a vessel for our values. How we decide to use our land shows what we think is important and what we think is unimportant. And by utilizing land that would have gone for cars for climate adaptation or cultural purposes, I think it speaks to a higher use of our space to honor our relationships with one another. And reducing parking, reducing car use also centers people. It ends up prioritizing the health and well-being physically and mentally of humans. And so a lot of what Parking Reform Network and some of your local organizations and your communities might work on is about getting rid of things like parking minimums. And when you do that, it makes it a little bit harder to drive because you know that you can't park your car somewhere. It creates some friction. What I'm going to talk about is something that's complementary to that. Not only do we want to make it harder to drive and park in places, we also need to make it easier and safer and nicer to not drive. Because if you're walking in a crummy location, if you're biking somewhere that's safe, you're very clearly and reasonably and rationally going to choose to use the car instead of alternate modes of public transportation. So this is a street that's near my house. It looks a little bit different today. They actually just planted 10 trees on the left-hand side like 2 days ago after like 4 years of advocacy. But this street sucks. It's really boring. So if you're walking towards this picture, which is the subway station, it's a really boring view. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing to engage or stimulate you. In the summer, it's incredibly hot because there's no shade structure. There's not anywhere for the water to drain. So it gets these really big, gross puddles full of garbage. And this has changed recently as well, but historically it's had unprotected bike lanes, which make it so that you don't feel safe as a cyclist. And if you had to choose to go down this street in your city, as a pedestrian, as a scooter person, as a cyclist, you probably would choose the car because this road kind of sucks. And so I'm going to talk to you about a couple local changes that you can make or that you can encourage your city to make walking more pleasant so that people don't want to drive and that it creates a little bit more safety from the climate crisis. The first is adding greenery to your community. If you're in charge of all of that hell strip, which is that parcel of land that goes between the sidewalk and the street in some cities, you're usually allowed to plant a tree in there. You probably want to do things like call your local dig safe line to make sure that you're not digging into a gas line and be aware of what the best kind of tree is for the size space that you're planting in. But it can have a lot of impacts to just put a tree or even a bush or some greenery there. The first is that it adds some beauty and visual interest. The second is that as it grows, it will create shade, making that sidewalk a lot cooler for people to walk down. And a lot of people don't know this, it has the added effect of traffic calming. A couple of years ago, I was doing community organizing work in Richmond, Virginia, and there was this street that would constantly flood. I'm talking like imagine water up to your shins. And on the other side of that street was where the city school bus picked up children. So on rainy days, and it rains a lot in Virginia in the summer, people would have to hoist their kids onto their hip, like grab the backpack, grab their work bag, and then slog across this nasty water to drop their kids off at the bus stop. And when we were doing our organizing around this flooding issue, I thought, well, obviously, people are going to want a cistern here, like a big box under the road to hold onto the stormwater and release it into the sewer. But when we talked to residents, what they were most interested in were actually trees. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first is if you've ever waited for a bus in Virginia, it's real hot in the summer. And without any shade structures, people were finding it uncomfortable to use public transportation. The second is that there was a lot of speeding that happened along that road, and folks were nervous about walking their kids from one side of the street where the housing was to the other side of the street where the bus stop was. And so they wanted to use these trees down this very straight roadway as a form of traffic calming to encourage motorists to slow down. And then finally, by exposing the pavement to, or pulling up the pavement, you're going to see better water absorbency from the trees. So if you don't have access to a health space, if you can't actually plant a tree in your front yard, what can you do? You can talk to your city officials, like find out who your city councilor is and encourage them to pass tree preservation ordinances so that the trees that are there can stay. And then also when new buildings are being put up or renovated in your community, there's usually public hearings for that. And you can talk about making sure that trees are part of the design plan for in front of that building to add greenery. Occasionally the city is going to say, we can't do that. There's too many gas lines underground, too many power lines above the ground. And the trees would put this infrastructure in danger. You can suggest alternatives, things like raised planter beds that you can put different types of greenery in that still add to visual diversity, make it more pleasant to walk, add to climate adaptation. Or you can just say, hey, friend, let's just, install some shade structures so it's at least not so boiling hot on this sidewalk. And if you are someone who has a business of your own, maybe you're part of a faith-based institution or a school, you can at least encourage them to make their parking structures useful. This is the Walden Pond parking area in Massachusetts, and they actually run the entire visitors center off of the electricity generated from these solar parking shade structures. Also, there's opportunities to make good uses of small spaces. Elizabeth, New Jersey is a city that is about 45 minutes south of New York City. It is the second largest port in the country, and the people who live in the formerly redlined neighborhoods, which is shown in this picture, experience flooding from two directions. One from overflows in the Elizabeth River. They also have combined sewer overflow issues, so that water often has sewage in it. And then also storm surges that come from the Atlantic during weather events. And they decided to take this really relatively small parcel that you could have used as a parking lot for the library, but they've chosen not to expand this area into a parking lot, and instead have chosen to use this as a microforest, which is a very dense planting of ground cover bushes and trees, which is estimated to give you the same benefits of a 50-year-old forest of the same size in about 5 years. And we've done our own impact evaluations at my workplace, Groundwork USA, and we found that there's pretty demonstrable a really good return on investment. You get about $4.25 in stormwater retention, air quality, and heat reduction value around a microforest for every dollar that you put into its building. And there's other things that people can use underutilized land for. If you remember that awful Claiborne Avenue Expressway in New Orleans that I showed you, this is what part of it looks like today. Our friends at Groundwork New Orleans have built a park that holds 68,000 gallons of stormwater, and provides a lot of shade benefits. The other benefit that I really like is you can't actually see the expressway anymore from the park because it's really gross and it smells bad. Another thing that's within your locus of control is to add visual diversity to your community. Unless you live in kind of a strict homeowners association place, you can paint your house. You can paint someone to add a mural to your house. You can add art and culture outside of your own house, or you can encourage the city planners and the city councilors in your community to add arts and culture dollars for the public right of way. It's always worth asking. If you don't ask, you don't get. And then finally, you can advocate for better bike infrastructure because people are going to choose to drive if taking your bicycle to work looks like this. Better bike infrastructure not only provides a way for people to get to work safely by modes of transit that aren't cars, thus reducing the pressure to have parking, it also gives you a good opportunity to add shade, to add beautification. And by reducing the number of cars on the road, you're reducing that heat that's coming off of the combustion engines, which is adding to the urban heat island effect. How do you advocate for bike infrastructure? A lot of cities have bike unions or cyclist unions. So just Google your city name, cyclist union, and see if something comes up. You also have the opportunity to reach out to your city councilor or to members of your public works, transportation, or planning offices. They will frequently do street design guideline redos, and that's a really good place to say, like, hey, are you guys redoing the street guidelines? Because I would love to see protected bike lanes pop up whenever you do a sort of a road, whenever you repave the road, which is something that the city of Cambridge, just across from where I live, does. All right. So those are like big infrastructure things. And you're like, Cate, I don't know who my city councilor is, and I'm too tired. I just can't. It's been a weird year. What can you do today in just a couple minutes? Well, the first thing is to remember there's no 100% solution to the climate crisis. We're kind of locked into a certain level of screwed, and we can't change it with a magic wand. What we can do is start to make small 1% changes that start to tip the scale towards safety and towards equity. One of the first things that you can do is to report poorly maintained storm drains. A lot of cities have 311 lines that you can dial to report issues, or see, click, fix apps on your phone where you can report infrastructure like this. This is a photo was taken in Boston. A road had been repaved, and so had a portion of the storm drain. So not very much water is going to get through that storm drain, and that's going to contribute to flooding. Something else you can do if you don't want to see, click, fix, or if the storm drains in your neighborhood look fine, is you can clear clogged storm drains just on your block. Go outside with some gloves and a trash bag and clear out any dirt, leaves, or debris so that there is a more direct path for that stormwater to get into the sewer system. And a number of cities across the country, from San Francisco to Somerville, have launched Adopt a Drain programs. So you should see if there's one in your community, because if there is, you can sign up to be the steward of your drain, and you get to name it. And here are some of the fun names that people in my community have named their drains. Dwayne The Rock Johnson, it's Draining Men, Great Expectations. So you can have a little bit of fun with it. The other thing that I would mention too is, and maybe this should have gone in the first section, is if you live in an environment with snow, and when we think about the climate crisis, we often think about the heat and not the extreme weather that can lead to snow and ice storms, but that does happen. Shoveling the curb cuts in your neighborhood, because again, it creates more of an incentive for people to walk if they know that they can do so safely. If you're someone in a wheelchair, if you're someone who's pushing a stroller with a small child, snowy curb cuts are the bane of your existence and makes you less likely to want to walk and instead to get in your car, thus necessitating parking. If you are in an apartment or in a home that has gutters on it, you can capture stormwater by adding rain barrels that keeps water from pooling up and ending up in your basement. And instead, you can utilize that for watering plants in your garden. I'm also a big fan of depaving. If you haven't been to a depaving party yet, go to depave.org, see if there's one in your community. It's basically this big party where someone in a community says, hey, I would like my driveway to be a little smaller, or my backyard's paved and no one's parking there, and I would love to use it for gardening. And the community comes together for free to rip up this pavement and help the person plant new things instead. And there's a role for everyone. If you aren't physically able to peel up the asphalt, which, like, as a footnote, is really satisfying to do, you can also do things like be in charge of the playlist, or bring snacks, or refill water bottles, or watch the children of other people so that they can participate in getting rid of that asphalt. The less asphalt we have in our communities, the less urban heat island effect and the less nuisance flooding that we experience. So, see it, rip it up. Another thing you can do is to adopt trees in your community. Trees, it's a hard life out there for an urban tree. And during drought, you can see the loss of mature trees. And so if you don't have access to a hose outside, something that you can do is to just grab an old milk or juice jug and kind of keep that by your front door, fill that up with water, and then just pour that into the tree box during a drought or during some extreme heat. On average, you should give about 1 to 2 gallons of water per inch in diameter of the tree, but even just 1 gallon in the tree box during an extreme heat event can be really helpful. A lot of cities have adopt a tree programs where you can sign up to help to take care of your trees, and they send you a text alert or an email alert during extreme weather events to ask you to water that tree, and to also report when there are issues, like if the tree dies or if it's looking really sickly or moldy or something. And then some other pieces that you can do is to reach out to your city councilor and just send them a quick email saying you support reduced parking minimums, and tree conservation ordinances, because if we're using our land for things that are going to help keep us safe from the climate crisis, I think that's a very human and people centered thing to do. And the less land that we have that's paved, the more that we have for green spaces. The final thing, and I'm going to wrap up the presentation with this slide, but the last thing that you can do, and one of the most important things from my perspective, is to get to know your neighbors, because the time to get engaged with your neighbors is not during a time of crisis. It's not when there's a flood or a wildfire or some other dangerous weather event. It's right now. That relationship building that you can do with your community is important to advancing not just your climate safety, but also greater harmony in the community. So even doing something like starting a block party or showing up to a block party that someone else planned with a bag of chips goes a long way in advancing the safety of your community and the relationships that you have with your neighbors. And one kind of cheesy but nice way to do that is maybe write them a holiday card. Maybe you say like, hey, I live 3 doors down for you. Just wanted to say hi, wish you well this winter season, and start to build those relationships with your neighbor. So that's it. If you wanted to learn more about how to do these things, how do I find my city councilor? How do I get engaged in advocacy? You can check out my book, Climate Action for Busy People. You can get it from the Island Press website, Amazon, your local bookstore, or the library. And you can learn more about all of this stuff. So thank you guys for being here, and thanks for listening. And I think we're going to take a couple questions.
Thanks so much, Kate. That was really a great presentation. A lot of inspiring ideas. Um, Stuff that I'm going to keep in mind next time we have a hot summer around street trees and stuff like that. I got a few questions I'd love to chat with you about, but I'm more interested in
Yeah.
than that in taking questions from our attendees. So I'd encourage everybody to either, post a question in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that, or there are few enough people here. I think the other option is you could use Zoom's little raise hand function, and that shouldn't get too out of hand here with the number of people we got. Tara McDaniel has raised her hand. So let's start with you, Tara.
Hi, Tara McDaniel, she, her. I'm with Arkansas Climate League and I live in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And we have an abundant amount of parking. And I've seen one parking lot that actually ended up building a restaurant on top of it. And that was one way to mitigate building another parking lot and then as well the concrete down for that actual restaurant too. But I think my question is more about talking and starting those conversations with our city board members and our city and our business leaders about reducing their parking. From what I understand, my city has a code that requires I can't quite remember how much, maybe one third of the amount of people that are could fit into the building to have a space and parking. So, can you give us some direction on starting those conversations and starting those conversations that are beyond the climate? In my particular area, climate is not a is not a value that's shared. So, I want to be able to talk to them in terms of things that would resonate.
Yeah, I'm happy for the parking reform people to jump in, and I'll speak specifically at the intersection between that sort of climate. And I hear you about climate not being a sort of a useful framing for these types of conversation and parking. I think that understanding people's priorities first and foremost, and coming from a place of deep listening about their priorities is something that's really important, because no one is favorable to someone coming into their situation and saying, I know more than you, this thing is much better. But instead hearing a little bit from them about what they think that their needs and also what some of their fears are. One of the things that really rattles the New England towns, which are just so intense about parking, like it's that and rats. Like those are the only two things that people complain about in sort of metro New England towns. And one of the fears that people have is, if we don't have enough parking, how are people going to get to my business? How am I going to make enough money? How am I going to be able to support my family and keep my economic situation where I want it to be? And there is a lot of research and a lot of studies that show that reducing these parking minimums, especially in more densely packed commercial areas, doesn't actually reduce the number of visits to businesses. People right out the gate don't usually like to talk with statistics, but that is something to have in your back pocket if you find out that economics are their concern. The other thing to note too is, what are some of the costs to doing business? If that location is dealing with flooding, if that location is dealing with really high utility bills that come from cooling, which I suspect are already pretty high in Arkansas. It's a lot hotter down there than in Boston. Those also might be points of interest to talk about. What can we do to cool the space? What can we do to beautify the space so that we can attract some more people here? And I think that's when you can also sort of influence the idea of, well, what if we utilize some of this space as a green space, or what if we tried to integrate shade structures or stormwater capture features that are doing sort of double duty of beautifying and encouraging people to come into this space, but also helping to meet some of the climate needs that we have. And I'm sure from a sort of a strictly parking reform perspective, our friends at PRN would have smarter, more helpful things to say, but that's what I would say from a climate perspective.
And please, if anyone would like to email me from PRN some more in-depth ideas, which these were amazing, thank you so much. But if anyone would like to have further those conversations, I'll put my email in the chat box.
Sure, please do. Thank you. Craig Timberlake had a hand up.
Yes, hi. So actually, Tara kind of touched on this very similar question that I had, but just that made me think of something that so where I live, we have a very kind of a very robust and kind of active sustainability community here, but I'm always amazed at how many people that are otherwise deeply involved in that have not thought about parking reform as from an environmental standpoint. So I'm just trying to think about how best to mitigate that, and how what resources I might be able to provide to those folks to really get them thinking about that, because it's the kind of thing that once they see it, right, they're like, oh yes, why have I never considered this before? But kind of getting to that point is something that I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I love for that, and the thing that pops into mind most for me, is actually the use of maps and geospatial information. And folks who are hearing this, don't get scared off if you don't have a GIS practitioner. There's a lot of stuff that's available online that you don't need to do anything with, that can show you things like where there's a great amount of impermeable pavement and where that's contributing to extreme heat. If that's contributing to extreme heat, that means that people are going to be using their air conditioners more, which means that we're releasing more fluorocarbons from our AC systems, which are going to add to this circular effect of continuing to raise the Earth's temperature. So I think one of the things that I've loved as a practitioner in my work is using geospatial information to help people kind of come to their own conclusions about it. One thing that we did, and that we've done in about 17 cities, is to actually come with, I don't know if any of you guys are old enough to remember like overhead projectors. You probably have to be like over 35 to remember this, but it was basically like this machine that looked like this, and there was a clear piece of paper, like acetate transparency, like a clear piece of plastic film that you would write on. You can actually print on those pieces of acetate, and you can print something like the tree canopy cover distribution, the impermeable pavement, where some of the really big parking lots are located. And the first thing people love to do when they see those maps is like, oh, there's my house, or there's where I work, or there's where I take my kids to school. And they tend to look around those neighborhoods, and you can actually have them layer the acetate transparencies on top of one another. So here's where the impervious pavement is. Oh, let's put the tree canopy. Whoa, all the places that have a lot of impermeable pavement, what's going on there? Wait, there's not a lot of tree canopy cover there. And then you can layer heat on top to talk about where that distribution is. And once you see it laid out like that and build the story yourself, it's really, really hard to unsee it. The other thing that I would also recommend is the sustainability crowd tends to also have an undercurrent of, not always, but tends to have an undercurrent of like community building. And how can you community build from your car when you're by yourself? There are way more effective ways to utilize even those small parallel parking spots that are outside of different neighborhoods, with things like pocket parks, places for people with disabilities to sit and relax and still be part of the fabric of life, or just anyone who's kind of tired of walking around. So I think talking about the community building angle of utilizing space as a vessel for our values. And is our value system really sitting by ourselves in our car? Or is it some connectedness? Is it arts and culture, or is it driving from one place to another without seeing or talking to anyone? So I would say a combination of geospatial data and related to and community building. But for the geospatial data, how do you get it? There's two ways. If you want to be hyper detailed and get like a bespoke like product, the biggest kept secret is the geospatial departments of local universities and colleges, because there's a whole bunch of kids who are learning how to use the software that need a practicum project, and you can be that project. You don't have to be part of an institution. You could just be a person who has a geospatial question, and they'll create those layers for you. So reach out to those departments to see if they have students willing to help. And then there's also a bunch of other tools like the tree equity score. The USDA Forest Service just released one on urban forestry, and a lot of municipalities, including Eastern Massachusetts, that have regional planning entities will produce geospatial tools that you can just take screenshots of. So geospatial data is a great way to not be able to unsee things that you previously did not see, and community building is a good angle.
There was one other hand up before. I don't know if that person still wants to ask a question, or if not, I think they've departed. Um, Kate, one thing that I was kind of hoping you could speak to. So I finished your book last night. I really enjoyed it. There was a segment in it that I really liked where you talk about naysayers, in a way that I hadn't thought about before. And it, connected in my mind to some of what we encounter with parking reform. But you frame the naysayer, which is someone in your community who's reflexively resistant to, your project or your goals, not as somebody to be, fought and overcome, or somebody to be demobilized, but someone who could actually be useful to your efforts. And I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that. I thought it was really novel and interesting.
Thank you for that. So, in my own personal organizing experience, I found sort of three categories of people that are important to creating change. The first is the expert, the person who knows how the system works, how it functions, where the levers of change are. The ally, who's just like kind of here for the party. They're willing to sign the petition, show up to the thing, maybe not all the time, but they're with you. And then the naysayer, who's the person who, as Daniel said, reflexively is like, nope, I don't like that. This is bad for our community. And that third category is someone that reflexively, my instinct is to avoid them. Like, I don't want to be around someone who is poking holes in my theory, who is taking this thing that's so important to me and trying to tear it down. But I have learned through the sweat and tears of organizing that they're actually someone who's really important to have at your table in an official or unofficial capacity, because they can do a couple of things for you. The first is they can point out different angles that help you to strengthen your argument that maybe you hadn't thought about before. And they can bring very realistic concerns up that then you can spend some time processing and coming up with wiser, stronger solutions. If you only have this very mono-dimensional perspective of how you fix something, you miss the opportunity to broaden the coalition, broaden the points and perspectives that you bring into potential solutions. And your solution's not going to be wise, and it's not going to be stable, because eventually at some point someone with a very similar negative argument is going to come along and poke holes in it. So having that naysayer at the table is an important part of being able to completely see the full argument. And an example of that was remember that crappy street I showed you the picture of in my neighborhood. That neighborhood had a really bad gas leak underneath that had killed all of the different trees. And we gathered together a group of people in the community to organize to have the gas leak repaired. We're fighting a multi-million-dollar corporation. And we brought one of the city engineers out with us who was like, no, this is stupid. We shouldn't fix it. And here's like all of the different reasons why. And dealing with that in real time by walking down the strip with him and hearing all of the different arguments that he had allowed us to craft a wiser and stabler request. So instead of digging up the whole thing, we asked for a sort of a patchwork to be fixed by a robot to fix all of the leaks in the joints. And eventually having him on our side and having him be out with us poking all these different holes allowed us to respond in real time and over a longer period of time to the concerns that he had. And he ended up actually becoming one of our biggest supporters and ended up coming to a city councilor meeting to say, hey, I was really skeptical about this, but I actually think trees are part of our infrastructure and we should treat that as such. So also if you are able to get those naysayers onto your side, eventually they can be very powerful and can bring some of the other naysayers with them.
Love that. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I've seen that with parking reform campaigns, especially at the local level too, where it's not even that you're not going to convince every naysayer and you're not going to quiet all the people who are going to show up and oppose you, but to go through the work of engaging with what they have to say. Like, other people are going to see that. Your elected officials are going to see that. you're going to come out with a stronger campaign for sure. Um, Again, happy to welcome any other questions from the audience. Just feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand. One other thing I'm wondering, kind of your work really speaks to the importance of this kind of hyper local engagement. Go out, look at the built environment where you live, look at the people who live in that place with you, and build community and organize around that. Um, that's interesting to me. PRN is in this nexus of a lot of different kind of policy and organizing worlds because parking touches on everybody's issues. And I think in some of the worlds where we overlap, that's a really kind of intuitive, obvious thing when you talk with environmental justice folks, disability rights folks, groups like that. And then there are other worlds, and I'm thinking specifically of like the zoning reform movement for abundant housing, for allowing more urban walkable cities, some of that stuff. Hyper local power has almost kind of acquired a bad name. Um, and some of that is disingenuous, some of it is understandable. Like we want to get things done. Come on, let's go to the top. We know what the bad policies are. Let's fix them. The one kind of critique that I'd love to hear your reaction to is this notion that hyper local power is inherently going to favor those who have a lot of access to power because they've got money, they've got time, they know how to speak the language of political power, they have the education to engage in those spaces. So if the answer to local kind of environmental quality of life issues is, as you say in your book and in your presentation, if you don't ask, you don't get. Um, I've had experiences on the ground where the people who are going to be best at asking and asking and asking are the wealthy, well-resourced neighborhoods. They get the street trees, they get the playground fixed at the community park. They get because they're better at asking and they have these advantages when it comes to asking. So I'm wondering, like, I guess sort of your response to that, like it feels to me like hyper local power, like knowing how to play that game is really, really important for marginalized and disinvested communities. But then there's a point where we have to bridge to systems change so that we're not fighting these fights over and over and over again, like basically begging for table scraps. What does that bridge look like?
Yeah, that's been a big part of my work at Groundwork over the last couple of years. We run this initiative called Climate Safe Neighborhoods, which is a partnership to build resident capacity to intervene in local systems so they can get a more equitable distribution of resources and an authentic decision-making seat at the table. And I think one of the reasons that I focus so much at the local level is I think that sort of systems change is a lot easier to accomplish than state or federal level systems change, where the goalpost is constantly moving. There's not a great context for people to intervene, and it takes you have to like sustain it for way longer than you do, I think, at the local level. I think the local level has a couple advantages. The first is that nominally your representation is a little bit more accountable to you than I think at the federal delegation or even the state delegation level, in part because you probably go to the same grocery store as your city councilor. So in theory, they should be working for your vote. They don't always do. They might oppose the things that you're interested in, but nominally they should be a little bit more responsive to you because they live where you live. And I think really leveraging that by getting to know them, showing up to the places where they are, and actually like saying hi and calling out when you see them in public. When you're like, I see you in the aisle of the Star Market, I'm going to say hello is important. I think also no one knows your community better than you do, and that knowledge can give you a really big advantage in creating differences in your neighborhood. An example of that is some of the communities that I've worked with in Rhode Island. A couple of the cities were doing a first come, first served, for your example, of trees and tree distribution. So they had like 150 trees. They would put it on the website. Hey, reach out if you want one. English only application online, which meant a very small segment of the population, which has a lot of Dominican and Cape Verdean immigrants, were actually able to read it, let alone fill out the application and access it. And the trees were gone like that. So what we did is we ended up going out with residents to map out literally just on a piece of graph paper, like where are the trees? And then worked with our local high schoolers to do things like take temperature readings, which you can get like a thermal imager for like a radiated thermal imager for like $20 at Home Depot, and found where it was the hottest at the intersections that the kids used to travel to school. And using that data and that knowledge of place was helpful in getting the urban forester of the city to recognize that first come first serve policy wasn't actually achieving the goals of the city. It wasn't making anything cooler or safer because this neighborhood where low income residents were, it was really hot. And so we were able to get the residents to change the city's distribution from a first come, first serve policy to an equity one by that knowledge. And I think the last point is that you can sustain local efforts, I think, a lot longer than you can sustain federal effort, because the thing that's annoying you is going to keep annoying you every day. So it kind of gives you that fire that once you see that injustice or that thing that's wrong in your community, once you understand who the people in your local community are that are making the choice to have that crappy thing still exist, I think it really drives you and can give you that energy that you need to get your neighbor involved, to get your partner involved, to get your best friend involved. So I think that hyper local work creates really wise solutions because no one knows your neighborhood better than you. It creates really stable solutions because if you're able to change the way resources and power are distributed at the local level, it is helpful, and it creates really, really wise solutions too, because it forces you to take that knowledge, take that systems knowledge, take that perspective that you have, and combine them into something. So that's my answer. I like local stuff. No one, I feel like no one's really coming on a white horse to save us from the federal level. So we gotta get things done at the local level.